Thanks for joining today's session. Today we're going to discuss how TRUCE Contextual Mobility and Jamf Pro create a great Apple experience. So my name is Joe Bro, and I am the Chief Technology Officer for TRUCE Software. So before we jump into what contextual mobile device management is, let's first establish the baseline on what mobile device management provides. So mobile device management can be used to help standardize all the devices in your environment. It helps with deployment, helps with inventory tracking, gives you the ability to manage those devices remotely. Things like remote wipe, resetting devices, putting devices into loss mode. It also allows you to push out third-party applications to help with your app deployment. It also gives you the ability to configure how that mobile device works. So things like what notifications might come through, is the camera allowed, which applications the mobile device should have access to, which applications the mobile device should not have access to, etc. Largely, these settings are static. You sort of set them up initially to configure your environment, and then you don't do much to change them over time. Jamf provides two really great tools, Jamf Setup and Jamf Reset, which helps to make this a little less static and a little more dynamic. The user can select which workflow they're currently in, and based off of that workflow, it changes what access they have. Perhaps their background or their wallpaper changes, which applications they have installed on the device might change. But this is a manual step. The user chooses to make this configuration change. And this is where contextual mobile device management provided by TRUCE in conjunction with Jamf Pro comes into play. So what is contextual mobile device management? Essentially, it gives you a way to automate that workflow. It gives you dynamic profile adjustments based off of your context, so the device automatically adapts to what you're currently doing in your environment to give you the right access to the right applications and device features at the right time, all based off of your current context and the policy you specified for that context. This creates a more personalized user experience. So basically, if you think about how this all fits together, you have your mobile OS, it could be iPad OS or iOS, utilizing your device management layer provided by Jamf Pro. And through an integration with TRUCE, we're able to dynamically change these profiles by issuing API commands to the device management layer, which changes which profile is currently applied on that mobile device. So let's talk about what context actually is. So one example could be vibration. So think about a piece of heavy equipment. Maybe it's a forklift. By detecting vibration, we can tell the difference between a forklift that is just sitting there versus a forklift that is actively being used. You might have a different policy for a forklift that is not currently operational versus when the user's actively using that forklift. You might restrict access. You might remove all of their applications or prevent incoming notifications. So the user's not distracted and potentially running into things while using that forklift. We can also look at motion as a context. So think about a vehicle that is stationary versus a vehicle that is actively being driven or in motion. We can apply different policies based off of that state. We can also look at proximity. So this could be proximity to beacons that TRUCE provides to put into the environment, or it can be hardware devices that might already exist in your environment. So think about a use case where you have a high-risk area in your facility. Based off of proximity to that area, we can apply a different policy. So as you enter that high-risk zone, perhaps all your notifications are automatically suppressed, access to all non-essential applications is removed, and then as the user moves away from that high-risk area and they're no longer near it, we can then restore access and go back to your default configuration again. Another common use case based off of proximity could be an area where it's maybe highly sensitive, where you don't want access to the device's camera. So as you enter into this sensitive area, the camera is disabled. As you leave this area, you regain access to the camera again. We can also use time of day or work group as a type of context. So based off of what work group the user belongs in or the time of day, is it currently working hours, you might have a different policy applied than if it's off working hours. A more advanced version of this can utilize third-party data feeds to look at actual duty status or schedule information provided by your system. So while the user is on duty, they might have access to all of the business apps, but their personal applications might be suppressed. Then when they're no longer on duty or they're off schedule, we can optionally hide all those business applications as an extra security feature so that they don't have any access to those apps while restoring access to their personal applications. This is great for an environment where the device might have a dual purpose, where it's being used as both a business device as well as a personal device. We can also look at location or geofence, GPS information as a type of context. So imagine using a GPS to specify a geofence around your entire facility. So while you're within that geofence, so essentially inside that facility, you might have a different policy configuration, specifying which applications are available, which device features are available. And then as that device leaves that GPS geofence, we can change the policy again. So imagine it's a device that should never leave that facility. As long as it's within the geofence, you have full access. But as soon as that device leaves, we can automatically remove all of the business applications so that you don't have any risk for a lost or stolen device, someone accessing these applications that you wouldn't want them to have access to. We can also do things like automatically triggering lost mode as the device leaves. And then once the device re-enters the geofence, we can automatically disable lost mode, all without any IT interaction necessary. So we're able to look at all this contextual information and provide a great and seamless user experience while still protecting the user's privacy. We don't track a device outside of protected states. We don't have any access to things like iMessage or emails or who they're calling. We don't have information about, browsing activity. We can't see photos or videos. None of this information is available to TRUCE. Instead, we're simply looking at the context of where and how this device is being used, and then applying the correct policy that you specified for that particular context. So think about it this way. TRUCE extensions Jamf Pro to provide a dynamic and automatic policy layer. So whether that's behind the wheel while driving, it's on the job site, or it's on an on-premise type environment. No matter which zone you're in, we're going to give you the correct policy configuration for that zone. So if you look at these two screenshots in the middle, the first one is the default configuration. This is how you've configured your device. It's sort of that static configuration we talked about at the beginning. So whichever applications and device features the user has access to, that's what they have when they're not in a protected zone. Then if you look at this image to the right, this is what happens once the user moves into a protected zone. So all of the non-essential applications are automatically hidden. And then once they leave that protected zone, they get full access to the device again. All the applications reappear. Now, it's worth noting we're not actually deleting applications here. So when the applications reappear, the user doesn't have to sign back in or log into these applications. We're simply showing or hiding these applications based off of the context and the zone that the user is operating in. So what are some types of policy configurations? So obviously we can specify which applications are available, but we can also configure device features, like is the camera enabled or is the camera disabled? We can also look at phone calls. So do you want to allow phone calling for this device? Perhaps all calls should go to voicemail while you're in a high-risk area. While driving a vehicle, maybe you only want to allow hands-free calling and all other calls go to voicemail. This is great for abiding by local, state jurisdictions around hands-free usage in a moving vehicle. We can also look at notifications. Should notifications be allowed to come in and distract the user in this zone, or should a notification be suppressed until the user is no longer in that particular zone, in which case they'll regain access to it? So now let's take a look at a video demonstration of how TRUCE works.
TRUCE integrates with Jamf Pro to create a seamless iPhone and iPad experience. When a user is not in a TRUCE protected zone, they have full access to their mobile device. Once the user enters a protected zone, the TRUCE experience is streamlined. TRUCE informs Jamf Pro to automatically hide all non-approved apps. An optional alert can let the user know that they're now in a TRUCE protected zone, in this case, a vehicle zone. The current zone information also appears on the device's lock screen. To use an allowed application while in a TRUCE protected zone, simply tap on the app. TRUCE and Jamf Pro ensure the right applications are available at the right time, based on company policy. In the vehicle zone, this user currently has access to maps, music, and podcasts. If the user moves into a new zone, like a warehouse, they can access a different set of allowed applications. Once the user is no longer in a TRUCE protected zone, they have full access to their mobile device again. That's the TRUCE and Jamf Pro experience on iPhone and iPad.
All right, so let's talk about how that video actually worked. So it's essentially a TRUCE system combined with an integration with Jamf. So we're utilizing a couple different APIs, their classic API, webhooks. You will give us a API user with the permissions that are identified here in the middle section under permissions. And once we have this integration in place, as we detect context, we will automatically talk to the Jamf system to apply the appropriate policy for that context that the user is currently operating in. All this happens automatically without any end user interaction needed. So essentially, we're empowering your workers to be both productive and safe with their mobile device. We can support many different deployment models. So we can work with a one-to-one deployment model. So this is essentially when a device is given to the employee as a device that they'll use while they're on the job, but then they'll also take it home with them at the end of the day. They'll charge the device up, they'll bring it back at the next day when they start their shift. This is a great device to look at a dual use model where we can automatically detect schedule or duty status and allow access to the business applications while the user is actively working. And then when they're off duty, give them access to their personal applications while suppressing access to those business applications. This could be triggered through a scheduling or a third-party integration. It can also be done by looking at GPS or location information. So when they arrive at the job site at the start of their shift, it can automatically apply the policy that gives access to the business apps and suppresses personal. And then when they leave that geofence at the end of the day, they now regain access to their personal apps. We also could work in a shared device model. So this is a model where when the worker arrives at the job site to start their day, they select a device from a pool of devices. They use that device throughout the day. And then at the end of their shift, they return the device back to some depot or some charging station. We can automatically change the profile as the user moves throughout the day with the shared device. So imagine the device is in a hospital and it's currently configured as a device for operating room usage. So it has the right applications and the right features you need to use it in an operating room. But for some reason, that device migrates and moves throughout the day and gets dropped off in a waiting room. The device can automatically reprovision itself at that point to function as a waiting room device instead of a operating room device, all automatically. In addition, we can provide reports and feedback about which zone or configuration all of your mobile devices are currently configured in, helping you track and see how these devices are moving throughout your facility. Sometimes these devices have a propensity to migrate from where they're supposed to be to a different area of your facility, and this ensures that the device functions appropriately for whichever context the device is currently in, and provides great reporting so that IT can track where these devices have migrated to so that it can be reprovisioned and moved throughout the facility as necessary. We can also work with the deployment model where the device is actually attached to a piece of equipment. So imagine a situation where the device is affixed to a forklift. While that forklift is stopped, perhaps the device has full access to whichever application they need to see their work orders. So they know what they need to pick up, what they need to move. But once that forklift begins to move, we can then restrict access to these applications so that the user is not distracted by incoming notifications or attempting to tinker with the workforce application while actually operating the forklift, which could be distracting and dangerous for the user. So let's talk about a couple different use cases. So a common use case for TRUCE is distracted driving. It's actually where we first started 10 years ago, was keeping these devices protected while people are operating vehicles, right? So while driving the vehicle, you might only want your driver to have access to navigation or route management software so they know where they need to go. You might also be restricting to just hands-free phone calls so they're not distracted by phone calls where they're picking up the handset and using it without using a hands-free device. And then a lot of times you might also want to allow something like music or something to keep the driver entertained while they're driving. But then once they arrive at their destination, you need full access to the rest of your applications. Maybe you now need access to the inventory app or the delivery app to know which package to scan and deliver. All this happens automatically. The user doesn't have to do anything manually. It just automatically changes to the correct policy based off of whatever it is you specified for their zone. And all these things are stack upon themselves, right? So as a user in the vehicle and driving, you have the right policy and context. Let's say you arrive at a factory now, and perhaps this factory was defined by a geofence. So as you drive into the yard, get out of the vehicle, you're now in the factory, you have a different set of configurations, a different policy applied, and then perhaps the user moves within that factory to a proximity beacon that designates a high-risk area. And again, in this area, the policy can change again. So all of this is dynamic. It's all real time. It happens automatically. And you can have various levels of context and policies depending on what experience you want your users to have while operating the device. Another common use case could be something like a one-to-one device deployment, where they're taking this device home at the end of the day, and then they're bringing it back the next day for their shift. Now, this could be a hospital, this could be a factory. It could really be any use case where you're providing these devices and you expect a user to sort of keep the device as their device. As we mentioned before, while you're on shift during your working hours, you give the appropriate business applications and device features you need to get the job done. At the end of their shift, we automatically can remove those business applications, give them access to their personal applications. Fantastic for a dual use model where you want to sort of have the extra perk of having a device you can use on your personal time, but ensuring when they're on business time, that device is being used in a safe and productive manner without all the distractions that might come from users getting Facebook messages and text messages and things while they're actually working. As we mentioned before, another use case could be the shared device model, right? As they're moving throughout this factory, they go into a high-risk area. At that point, maybe all notifications are turned off. You don't want any incoming dings or bings or anything distracting to the user while they're in the high-risk area. And then as they move away from that, they regain access to their mobile device. We can look at entering and exiting different locations, changing which profiles are being applied based off of different buildings they might be in. It's all highly configurable based off of what experience you want to deliver to your users. Equipment operation, this could be a forklift, it could be a bulldozer, crane, whatever it is that your users are using. We can change policy based off of the fact that that piece of equipment is operational, or if that piece of equipment is not operational. Obviously, if the user's just walking through the yard and they happen to get near a forklift that is just sitting there, then nothing should change with their policy, right? They're not actually using the forklift. But based off of that vibration, based off of that motion or that movement, we then will apply the policy while the forklift is operational to apply your policy. Again, common configurations could be no notifications, no access to applications while it's moving. But as soon as it stops, you get access to your workflow app so you know what you need to do next with that forklift. And then this is one we've talked about many times here because it's a very common use case, something we get asked about all the time, is how do we help make these mobile devices support both a personal use as well as a business use. And it's a fantastic use case, right? As the user is working, all the personal apps are hidden. They have full access to their business apps. Again, these policies can change as they're doing something different. Perhaps they're on shift, but now they're in a vehicle or operating equipment. So the policy will adapt to that more localized context of what types of equipment or motion they're currently doing. Then when they stop that, it goes back to just having access to business apps. And then at the end of the day, when they leave the facility completely, they now get access to their personal apps. And as I mentioned before, you can optionally remove access to business apps as sort of an extra security layer to ensure that that user doesn't need access to business apps when they're on personal time. Then there's no reason to keep those business apps installed on that device. This can especially be important for workers that might be in Europe, for example, where there's more stringent laws around HR, where you don't want users to be checking their email or using business apps when they're on personal time. We can help facilitate that type of deployment for you. So to sort of summarize, what we're going to do is we're going to help empower a productive user experience, the right access to the right applications, right device features, at the right time based off of the user's current context for whatever policy you define for that particular context. This helps protect your organizations from liability. Keeping your workers safe, productive, that's essentially what TRUCE plus Jamf Pro on the Apple platform can give you. So thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day.